Merci à tous d'être revenus dans la salle. Donc, alors nous sommes un peu en retard, une bonne demi-heure maintenant, on va essayer de rattraper un petit peu parce qu'hélas, nous ne pouvons pas garder la salle avec beaucoup de retard. Voilà. Donc, peut-être que je devrais, ou avec Angelica, nous devrons interrompre ou dire là vraiment on est obligé de terminer bientôt et j'en suis confus. Donc la session 2, marché du livre, recherche des provenances et sauvegarde du patrimoine écrit. Nous allons commencer tout de suite avec une communication de Joseph Hone, auteur et historien du livre, qui va nous parler de T.G. Wise, un faussaire démasqué par de jeunes libraires. Je lui laisse la parole.
Thank you. I think. Thank you for the invitation to speak with you today. Thank you also to the translators for hopefully making me more eloquent in French than I am in English. And to make their lives easier, I will cleave fairly closely to some prepared remarks. Next month will mark the 90th anniversary of one of the great works of English bibliography. Here it is. An inquiry into the nature of certain 19th century pamphlets by John Carter and Graham Pollard. This book dropped a bomb onto the London rare book scene in the summer of 1934. This rather lovely copy with the original jacket, which is quite rare, is currently being sold by James Cummins of New York, whose photograph this is. By a meticulous examination of text, type, and paper, Carter and Pollard, then still in their late 20s, were able to prove that 46 of the most coveted and valuable first editions of the Victorian age were modern fakes. Their chief suspect was a man who decades earlier had claimed to discover these books and who had acted as their primary cheerleader. He was former president of the Bibliographical Society, honorary graduate of the University of Oxford, and member of the Roxburgh Club. His name was Thomas James Wise. The general contours of the Wise story will doubtless be known to many of you, if not most of you. And I suspect that several people in this room have probably seen, handled, and perhaps even sold Wise forgeries over the years, for which there remains a thriving market. Certainly, I'm sure everyone in the room is a firm friend of John Carter. For what bookseller doesn't have a well-thumbed copy of ABC for book collectors on their shelves? But for those of you unacquainted with Wise, here is a very brief précis. As a young collector on the make, Wise started making little bijou facsimiles for discerning admirers of Percy Shelley, Robert Browning, facsimiles that were prima facie entirely legitimate, but which, when unstitched from Wise's brief introductory essays and artificially aged, using smoke or tea, might, and indeed sometimes did, pass for pristine originals. It didn't take long for the trade to cotton on, and that they realized that examples of these facsimiles were being touted on the market, faked up by person or persons unknown. Side-by-side comparison of the doctored facsimile against the authentic original always showed up the fake. As Wise himself put it in his bibliography of Swinburne, in a statement of quite staggering audacity, easy as it appears to be to fabricate reprints of rare books, in actual practice it is impossible to do so in such a manner as detection cannot follow the result. And so Wise started playing a more subtle tune. Instead of trying to duplicate valuable first editions of Victorian poems, the modern firsts of the 19th century, he would invent and backdate new editions, little privately printed or strictly limited editions of short texts by major writers, such as George Eliot or Rossetti or Browning, that were otherwise known only from collections or magazines. Little keepsake editions that were otherwise, might otherwise have slipped the collector's net. Because there were no authentic editions against which to compare these invented firsts, collation, comparison, these would be of no help. Essentially, Wise was making type facsimiles of books that did not exist, filling gaps in the literary record with plugs of his own creation. It was only in the 1930s, when Wise was in his 70s and a collector of seemingly undisputed authority, only then would two young London booksellers, and it's important to remember that they were booksellers, Carter and Pollard, place these creative forgeries under the lens, discovering anachronisms both in the typography and in the chemical makeup of the paper on which the books were printed. Through this pioneering approach to forensic bibliography, Carter and Pollard were able to prove the fraudulent nature of the books and lay them at Wise's door. I tell this full story in my new book, shameless plug, The Book Forger, published this spring in the UK by Chatto and Windus. My purpose in writing the book was, and indeed remains, threefold. First and foremost, my intention was to bring the Wise story to a new audience, including people who perhaps had never previously even thought about rare books or book collecting. It is, in a sense, an act of evangelism. But second, I also wanted to address what I have long thought a gaping chasm in how old and rare books are studied in Anglophone universities. I work at one such university, and among my academic confreres there is, I believe, a shocking blindness to the contribution of the trade and members of the trade to the development of bibliographical studies. When Anglophone histories of the bibliographical disciplines are written, they trumpet the names of Sir Walter Gregg and Ronald McKerrow, but Carter and Pollard are usually relegated to the status of a footnote before being shuffled off stage in what I can only assume to be an act of academic snobbery. And so what I wanted to do in the book was to shine a light on that scholarly contribution made by Carter, by Pollard, and also by their contemporaries in the trade, including Percy Muir, founding member of ILAB and the League's president from 1950 to 1952. I wanted to show them for the pioneers that they were. We now come to target number 3, and that is the unresolved puzzle of who knew what and when. You see, there can be little doubting that Wise had accomplices. The best known of these was Harry Buxton Forman, who seems to have planted the idea for creative forgery in Wise's brain, and collaborated with him for several years before Wise's bad behaviour grew too much for him. And there must have been an accomplice in the printing firm of Clay and Sons too, who aided Wise with the production of facsimiles in the early days and with his forgeries thereafter. But going into this project, I had suspicions about another party, the distinguished London bindery Riviere and Son. Again, Riviere will doubtless be a familiar name to most of the people in this room, known for their use of buttery Morocco, elaborate doublures, tasteful use of gilt, and near miraculous skill in paper grafting, restoration, and facsimile. A suspicious number of Wise forgeries entered the market already bound by Riviere, who was Wise's preferred binder. Consider the following red flag. I know of 14 copies of one Wise forgery, bound almost uniformly by Riviere, that the contemporary trade was led to believe existed in an edition of 12 copies. Now, how this didn't sound alarm bells stretches credulity. The staff at Riviere must have known that these little first edition pamphlets were not the outrageously rare impossibles that Wise claimed them to be. The smoking gun of Riviere's complicity turned up while I was studying another, perhaps even more sinister dimension of Wise's career, and one that's very pertinent to today's theme. Wise's mantra as a collector was perfection. His friend A. Edward Newton once joked, "I know the word which will be found graved on Mr. Wise's heart when it is opened. It is the word condition. Only books that are practically faultless need knock at Mr. Wise's door." It will therefore not come as a surprise to learn that Wise, though he did not confess it at the time, was a great fan of sophisticated and made-up books. A large proportion of the 16th and 17th century books in his library were not so much perfect as perfected from multiple copies, with margins rebuilt and the differently aged papers bleached and toned to a uniform shade of café au lait, all done by the hands at Riviere. Such habits, though undesirable, were not unusual among the bookmen of the early 20th century. It was not, however, common for collectors to steal the leaves that required to make up a perfect book, but that is what Wise did. Go to the British Library today, and you can still see the stubs where Wise tore leaves from early 17th century, that's Riviere, here we go, stubs, where Wise tore leaves from early 17th century playbook quartos. For a long time, it was assumed that Riviere were unwitting stooges in this criminal enterprise. They cooked the meal, but it was Wise who supplied the raw ingredients. However, and following on here from our earlier erudite remarks on stamps, there's plenty of evidence to show that Riviere knew precisely where Wise was sorting his materials. His copy of Christopher Marlowe's play The Jew of Malta, for instance, which was later sold to the American collector John Henry Wren, and which is now at the Harry Ransom Center in Texas, as a near-invisible circular repair to the final leaf. Disguised by Riviere, you can see the scar there where new paper's been laid in, and on the other side, on the recto, you can see where they've used pen facsimile to fill that gap. As Aaron Pratt at the Harry Ransom has pointed out, the size, shape, and location of this repair corresponds precisely with the 19th century British Museum stamp. And if you consult the British Museum copy of the play, you'll find it's missing this leaf. Or consider Wise's copy of Pope's An Essay on Man. The British Museum used to have a copy of this first edition. Call up the shelf mark today, and all that will arrive is a detached title page. The rest of the book is missing. This is Wise's copy. The first edition of An Essay on Man is a folio pamphlet, which means that the A1 and the A2 ought to be conjugate, but obviously these come from different copies. The A1 is much shorter than the A2, and there's also something very odd going on here. Remember, transmitted light shows through more brightly in patches where paper is thinner. Something has been done here to make the paper thinner. If we get rid of that A1 and put in the British Museum detached title page, aha, it's the correct size. The correct watermark is in the correct position. The chain and wire lines are precisely where we would expect them to be. Moreover, if we overlay the two images and fade it away, you will notice that the British Museum stamp is precisely corresponding to that strange patch of thinned paper on the Wise copy. What we are seeing here is where Riviere's expert craftsman have scraped away ink bleed from the museum stamp, where they eradicated incriminating evidence of the book's provenance before adding a title page cannibalized from another copy. We put that stamp back in, you can see it corresponds precisely. Okay, let's get rid of that. The news of Wise's thefts was broken in the 1950s by David Foxon, but he stopped short of accusing Riviere of complicity. However, while combing through his papers in the Harry Ransom Centre, we find the smoking gun, a letter relaying information from the British Museum's superintendent of bindings, who had actually undergone his apprenticeship at Riviere during the heyday of their work for Wise. As a trainee, the letter reported, and I quote, "He grew curious about where Wise got all these loose leaves and asked Culkin, the firm's manager, who said," and again I'm quoting the line here, "he steals them, of course." In the minutes that remain, I want to address today's theme a little more directly through the lens of Wise. For many of the books that Wise made up with stolen leaves were sold to or traded with other collectors, particularly wealthy American collectors who, though shrewd in business, proved particularly hapless in their dealings with Wise. Many of these books have now been traced, but a goodly number of them must still be in private hands or circulating in the trade. And so my question is this: what do we do with books that contain stolen material, but which are not in themselves stolen? Is this the kind of book, for instance, that should end up in the ILAB Missing Books Register? That question isn't superficial. Consider the implications. How much of a book needs to have been stolen before the book is itself considered stolen? We have here a bibliographical correlate of the famous ship of Theseus paradox. Does a ship that's had all its components replaced one by one remain the same ship? Does a book possess spatio-temporal continuity? Such questions are far too elevated for this humble bibliographer. But when Wise's thefts were exposed in the 1950s, there were high-level negotiations between the British Museum and the University of Texas, where many of the books that Wise had patched up with stolen leaves ended up. And at one point, it was proposed that these books should be disbound and separated, and their constituent parts returned to their respective homes, with the British Museum leaves returning to London. Now, this proposal was eventually rejected, and from my perspective, thank goodness. Such efforts to undo the damage of Wise's thefts would only have distorted and obscured the history of these particular books. The only thing it would have accomplished, in my view, is, making Wise even more difficult to study. But it's tricky to imagine the British Library, or indeed any other national library, being so sanguine about restitution today. I don't pretend to have any answers to these questions, but what I think the Wise example demonstrates is that there are still things that we can learn from historic cases of book crime. Returning to the past can provide new angles for thinking about the present and for planning for the future. Through educational initiatives, such as the rare book schools at Virginia and in London, or the York Antiquarian Book Seminar in the UK, sponsored by the ABA Educational Trust, through trade infrastructure, such as the ILAB Missing Books Register. But ultimately, there needs to be greater recognition and collaboration between the academy, libraries, and the trade. And it's on that note that I will end. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Joseph Hone, pour cette intervention qui rappelle qu'il y a de temps en temps des faussaires dans notre métier qui mettent en péril l'expertise des libraires et également la recherche de provenance au défi. Alors, est-ce que quelqu'un aurait une question pour Joseph Hone, rapidement?
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Christian Jensen. I'm formerly head of the collections at the British Library. Just to complement what you said, we had a more recent spate of theft of single leaves by Mr. Farhad Hakimzadeh in the 10 years to 15 years ago. One leaf was found to have been bound into another copy, which has been sold to the folger. The folger volunteered to return that leaf, so it has now been reunited with a suitable note to the effect. Thank you.
You have another microphone at the stage. Very quickly, thank you. I just have a question because I'm fairly certain that I've seen Wise copies for sale at auction. And so do you assume that every copy Wise ever owned was forged in some way or cannibalized, as you say?
No, so Wise was, I mean, he was a serious collector, and a seriously good collector. Apologies. No, not at all. So Wise was a very good collector and a pioneering collector in his own way. But certainly his pre-1700 books, many of which are now in the British Library, and they are at this very moment being properly catalogued after the best part of 70 years of not having been catalogued, but being in the institution. And those books are certainly, a great many of them are made up. A great many of them are very heavily restored, is a generous way of putting it.
Merci beaucoup. Nous allons donc passer à l'intervention. Alors je rappelle que les discussions pourraient être poursuivies tout à l'heure autour d'un verre, comme nous sommes un petit peu en retard.